This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to an Agenda Special. I'm Stephen Cole. Brexit is done, the transition period is over, but just what does the future hold for relations between the UK and the EU? Join me and my special guest as we consider the world beyond Brexit. The Brexit Express has reached the terminus. The journey is over. The UK stands alone. But where's the train been? Well, here's a brief whistle-stop tour. On the 23rd of June 2016, the UK voted to leave the EU in a referendum. On the 29th of March 2017, the then UK Prime Minister Theresa May sends a letter to the European Council President Donald Tusk, triggering Article 50. That's the legal mechanism for a member state of the EU to leave. It sets the date for the UK's departure as March the 29th, 2019. But when we got to that date, the UK didn't leave the EU. Instead, the leave date is extended to get a withdrawal agreement passed in the UK Parliament. Then, 7 months later, the UK was supposed to leave. Again, it does not. The new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, reluctantly writes to the EU Commission asking for another delay in an attempt to get the withdrawal agreement through the UK Parliament. But on the 31st of January 2020, 2 general elections and 2 Prime Ministers later, the UK finally leaves the EU, nearly 4 years after the original vote, and immediately an 11-month transition phase began. Most arrangements remain the same, but both sides face a race against the clock to sort out future EU-UK trade relations. And the deadlock lasted all through the summer, the autumn, and Christmas. The main sticking points hadn't changed. They were fishing rights, the so-called level playing field, a set of shared trading rules and standards. Deadlines came, both sides by now were playing high-stakes brinkmanship, and went. The big question was always, will the Brexit Express hit the buffers or pass smoothly through the tunnel? And suddenly, the European Express reached the end of the line, but not at Waterloo. Happy New Year. And on December the 24th, Christmas Eve, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced the deal is done. But after 4 years of negotiations, is that deal enough to keep the peace in a post-Brexit era? Well, joining me now to consider life after Brexit for Europe and the UK is Peter Klepper, a policy analyst at Open Europe in Brussels, and Professor Amelia Hadfield, head of politics and the director of the Centre for Britain and Europe at the University of Surrey. Welcome, both of you. And I want to start with Professor Hadfield. Amelia, Boris Johnson insists this deal is the UK taking back control. Is that how you see it as a committed European?
It's a bit of everything. I think it's a very good political attempt to square what I think up until very recently looked like a very difficult circle. It has a variety of elements to it, which I'm sure we're going to be discussing. Primarily, it's trade and cooperation, but there are a lot of other areas which were added as well, including economic and social and environmental, and of course the notoriously difficult fisheries area. And there's also other areas, including citizen security. I think there was genuine worry that that wouldn't get included, and there are some decent areas that have been ticked off. And of course, I think for me, because I am interested in where the two relations or the two sides work in terms of foreign and security policy, there's a degree of a governance framework with regards to lasting cooperation. For me, it's bittersweet. I didn't want to have to, see Britain remove itself from the European Union, but as many politicians have increasingly told us, we are not leaving Europe as a whole. So I think some good work has been done. I'm sure Peter will join me in this, but I think there's some areas of very genuine friction, which we're going to be seeing pretty soon. But it's a very good start. It's a good start, Stephen.
All right. Well, that's a good beginning. Damned with faint praise, I think we'd call that, Amelia. Peter Klepper, in the end, the predicted chaotic divorce was avoided. Did it come down, Peter, to who blinked first?
Well, I did not predict that. Actually, I was always quite optimistic, which wasn't so hard if you think about it. If you look at what happened when France no longer allowed truckers to come from Britain, nothing to do with COVID, but nothing to do with Brexit, but with COVID. I mean, you could see enormous chaos and trouble. So I don't think it was hard to predict that a deal was eventually going to be struck. And indeed, that's a very good thing. The friction points for fisheries, a level playing field, some kind of a straitjacket that the EU wants to impose on the UK, and governance, and some kind of an arrangement has been found on all three of that. And that's extremely important for both sides. The cost of a no deal would be extremely high. It was wrong when people were claiming that also with a no deal, that there would not be a big difference. I mean, a lot of arrangements have been made now for business. But that said, I think we'll have to await judgment till July, because there may be still a lot of extra friction for business. And I would not be surprised if some parts of the deal need to be renegotiated to cater for that.
So in your view, Peter, the jury is still out. Amelia, as Peter mentioned, the level playing field, that was the level playing field were the three words that were apparently the big problem to try and reach a deal, as well as fishing. The EU clearly didn't want the UK to be what they saw as unfair competition, did they, post-Brexit? And that's what we were talking about, is it the level playing field?
Yeah, I think level playing field has been used to sort of cover a manifold series of sins. But I think what it actually boils down to is making sure that both sides get a fair crack at remaining competitive with regards to the degree of access that they've allowed each other to have vis-a-vis the single market. The idea, of course, is to make sure that they trade competitively now in goods, but also in services. And we need to remember, actually, that the deal done now really, for the most part, covers only goods. There are bits and pieces with regards to the regulation of aspects of services, but services is something that they're going to start looking at in March. So, you know, if you're enjoying the Brexit ball game, come back for more, because there's a great deal. There's a great deal more to be said, that's for sure.
So does that mean, Amelia, does that mean the deal hasn't been done?
Oh, no, it's been done, but it's a partial deal. Let's put it this way. At this point, it includes a variety of the most pressing, most important areas with regards to the need to hammer out cooperation between both sides. And obviously, in terms of goods going back and forth, that was elected really to be the first thing to look at. I find it slightly curious myself, because goods comprise at this point really only 20% of British GDP, and indeed 20% of employment. But much of that hinges on the manner and the type of export that Britain has built up with the continent over the past few years, and that includes fish. So there are areas that are very totemic, if you like, very symbolic of what Britain currently feels itself to be as a sort of burgeoning new sovereign unit. But let's be under no illusions. There are many areas with regards to financial services, the role of the City of London, and things like passporting that are not in the deal and will still need to be looked at on the basis of another treaty.
It'll certainly be interesting to see trading on January the 4th to see how those trades are going. Just before I come to you, Peter, Amelia, sort of how much of the prophets of doom, the Remainers' prophets of doom, were correct? And how much was the drawn-out negotiations a lesson, a warning to other countries? I think it was the Greek finance minister who said, you know, this is all like the Eagles song, the Hotel California, you know, you can check out, but you can never leave. Was this a warning to other countries?
I think the European Union were very clear that they don't want it to happen again, but it was, at least from the British perspective, a democratic mandate, a referendum that, you know, even though it was pretty much on the knife edge, tipped 51.9%, you know, towards the need to feel that they were decoupling from the Union. The prophets of doom, I think, come in various guises. Some, I think, to be honest, just feel again, but it's a bittersweet moment that after 43 years of relationships with the European Union, in areas where Britain, in a sense, has been an unsung hero in foreign and security policy, in things like enlargement policy as well, that many of those are now going to have to be laid down. And that relationship has to start either completely from scratch, or it will be so fundamentally altered that it's not going to look at all like what it did. I will say one thing, Stephen. I think the prophets of doom, if they live anywhere, they may live in Dover. So we will have to see, I think, to some extent, what is going to be a very real, at least a short-term impact, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of the need for customs declarations. Upwards of 200 million a year.
Yes, no, that's going to be difficult stuff. Peter, just to continue the hotel analogy, when you leave a hotel, there's always a bill to pay. Will the UK have to pay a bill for regaining its sovereignty?
Well, it depends how you define it. I mean, some arrangements have been made about indeed outstanding payments, financial payments the UK still have. If you're using it in a more figurative meaning, I think the EU is not keen to punish Britain. I guess some people perhaps were. I mean, what they want to do is to make clear that indeed there are benefits to EU membership, which is why they are restricting some access for British service providers, for example, to operate in Europe. I think this is very unwise. I think, for example, about bands. It's been emerged that British music bands will have a hard time doing tours in Europe. I mean, is this really benefiting EU citizens? Me, as an EU citizen, I do not see the benefit at all. So I think we have to keep in mind that trade benefits both sides. I just heard Theresa May, the former British Prime Minister, saying in the UK Parliament that, or suggesting that it was not such a good deal for Britain because it's mainly the EU that benefits from goods trade, which is of course completely wrong because both sides benefit. The UK has factories like BMW, Airbus on its territory, and it's very much in the UK's interest to have a frictionless trading goods. Now, I know that unfortunately, as a result of this deal, there will be more friction, but this does not have to be the end of it. I think we could see some renegotiation to basically facilitate business. Also, when you look at rules of origin requirements, all kinds of bureaucracy that British and European businesses will now face. I mean, like EU citizens, I don't think appreciate this. The EU basically has to accept that the UK is now a sovereign country that will come up with different rules, and we all know the UK. I mean, I think we just have to accept that this is largely equivalent, and we have to trust UK regulation.
Okay, Amelia, what's your take on that?
Well, I think, as Peter said, I mean, it's rather uneven. Some agreements have been made in some areas, which we might have expected, but there are some pretty big gaping holes in others. Professional services equivalence, for example, I think hasn't been nailed down. And areas which I find curious, some areas have a dispute settlement mechanism attached to them, and some don't. So state aid, for example, comes under the provision of being able to, hammer out a dispute with the European Union, and others don't. And again, as Peter said, things like rules of origin. I think we've seen the European Union prepared to be flexible with regards to the percentage of raw materials that come into the UK and the European Union, but that's nailed to a sliding scale. So the idea is in the next sort of 4, 5, and 7 years. Raw materials are progressively supposed to be sourced from EU and UK. And that sort of suggests that they're building up again a sort of ecosystem between the two. So there are areas where there's clear divergence between either side, but I think there's also scope for realignment. And it's kind of walking that very difficult line between Theresa May's initial Chequers plan, which proposed a common rule book and then of course was shot down in flames. And then the idea of rather more competition between two sides, which is what this deal is. But the idea, of course, and Peter's kind of put his finger on it, greater competition between the two sides suggests ultimately you are part and parcel of a dual ecosystem. So although this does to some extent press the reset button in the next 5 to 10 years, if there aren't too many disputes between each side, maybe they'll get along better.
Okay. Could it provide a reset button for the EU as well? I mean, we all know Europe is dominated by the Franco-German axis, don't we? Did the UK, Amelia, act as a sort of counterweight to that, a sort of European conscience, an Anglo-Saxon European conscience?
I think Britain has always enjoyed a combination, Stephen, of splendid isolation where it sits happily on its hands and does nothing, and then sort of weighs in to make sure that there's not a European hegemon at any given time. So you can see just as much evidence, I think, of British working cooperatively with France and Germany, depending on what is wanted at the continent at any given time. But I think with Brexit, the center of power swings to some extent, away from France and Germany. I don't think they're going to hold the sort of anchor point that they necessarily have to. There are a lot of very real issues, I think, in terms of north, south, and east, west divisions, and mopping up the impact of COVID on the European Union as a whole, I think, allows people to ask serious questions about the mode of governance, the mode of recovery, the need to inject new initiatives like the Green Deal. So although I think the time is ripe for lots of new things to be happening, the EU now has to think very carefully about how to move past the bruises of Brexit, if I can put it like that.
And Peter, your view of that, was the UK a little bit of an awkward squad for Brussels? And if so, who would take over that role in future?
The UK has indeed always served as sort of the brake to further centralization of power and money. And the group that may take over that role has been called the Hanseatic Group of EU member states, which is basically the Netherlands, Scandinavian, Baltic countries, and perhaps Ireland, which is, of course, let's say, a relatively weak group, at least as compared to the United Kingdom. I do think that as a result of Brexit, the UK will keep having an influence on the core of the EU, of the EU's power, and that is its regulatory machine. Now, whenever the EU will come up with a regulation or a policy, think of, for example, its vaccine policy now, because it will be easier for the UK to diverge, people will tend to look at how the British do it. And I think this will impose a blissful dynamic of regulatory competition on the EU.
All right, Peter Klepper and Professor Hadfield, we're going to take a break there, and we'll come back shortly with more on life after Brexit. And welcome back to our agenda special looking at life beyond Brexit. Still with me are Peter Klepper, a policy analyst at Open Europe in Brussels, and Professor Amelia Hadfield, head of politics and the director of the Centre for Britain and Europe at the University of Surrey. Professor Hadfield, the Trade Secretary, Liz Truss, has been, and others, have been racking up the air miles trying to sign trade deals around the world. Is that all good news for the British economy, for the UK?
I hope it is. Certainly, one of the benefits that was loudly propounded by Brexiteers in general was that Britain no longer had to be part of the trade ecosystem within the European Union. And by cutting itself loose, albeit with a degree of very real friction in terms of future trade with the European Union, and now has a degree of extra freedom. So it's sort of friction for flexibility, if you like, and that's the toss-up that they've had to look at. So Liz Truss, as you correctly say, has been either jetting around or certainly zooming around in terms of being able to make
yes,
that a variety.
More accurate.
Yes, exactly. And the idea, of course, is that this is very much part of that sovereignty narrative that you picked up to begin with, Stephen. The idea of Britain being allowed out, if you like, from underneath the structures of the European Union, being allowed its flexibility, its rights to strike deals with other parts of the world, to cultivate free trade agreements and relationships on areas that make them, most sense to both sides. There have been a long number, if you like, but the degree to which they're genuinely going to impact on the overall trade proportion of Britain at this point is actually still very, very small. Nothing is going to ever compete with regards to the ratio with which Britain trades in terms of its goods, at any rate, with the European Union. So I would take these with a pinch of salt from my perspective.
All right, begrudging from Professor Hadfield. Peter Klepper, I mean, these deals, will they have any impact on global trade? Are any of them game changers?
Well, these are very important deals. Game changers is perhaps a bit much. Well, what has happened this year is that the United Kingdom has negotiated that the access it has to, for example, countries like Turkey, but also Canada, was access it enjoyed as an EU member state, and the UK has now negotiated that this will continue even if it's no longer an EU member state. That said, the real work will only begin now. Now the UK has the opportunity to do better than the EU and to try to negotiate trade deals with partners that the EU has so far not managed to negotiate with. That won't be so easy, but I think ultimately the UK is a very attractive destination to do business. So I would imagine many countries will be standing in line to negotiate a deal with Britain. Perhaps when you're talking about agriculture, then the UK may end up facing the same obstacles that the EU faced when it was trying to negotiate a deal with the United States, which of course would be the biggest prize, because the US is still the world's biggest economy. Now, on both sides, there's a lot of appetite, unfortunately, for protectionism when it comes to agriculture. So I think if the UK generally wants a proper deal with the US, it also has to rethink some of its dogmas about chlorinated chicken, for example. Or GMO foods. So I mean, that's the kind of debate that you will
get into later. And Amelia, we talked about the disruption Brexit might have caused, but will this help unify the EU, or could it act as a future disruptor?
That is very much the question for 2021, Stephen. I think to some extent, the very real changes that Brexit has impacted on, and the consequences in the European Union are going to continue to be felt and asked. I think particularly in areas or in countries, member states like Poland and Hungary, which at this point seem to be undergoing a variety of sort of mini sort of decouplings of their own, taking real issue with things which up until sort of 5 or 10 years ago were absolutely de rigueur, very much at the integrationist heart, if you like, or the philosophy of the European Union. But it's interesting how Brexit has raised, possibly under the populist banner, questions which have not necessarily really been asked before about the limits of integration in terms of depth. And also, I think the expansion of the European Union in terms of numbers of membership. It's an issue that is danced around from the sidelines, sometimes when things go well and sometimes when things don't. But the actual stepping out of a member state, I mean, that is such a very real foreign policy deal, as well as the sort of disintegration of one aspect. And it shows, I think, that the European Union needs to rethink the original methods and modes behind unionism and the federated and structured and internationalized way in which it sort of puts itself together as an entity, and think clearly about not just what works now in 2020 and 2021, but where it genuinely wants to go as an actor. So from my perspective, the quality of European Union actorness, if you like, is it going to be the top dog in the region? How is it going to interact with its neighbors? How is it going to sell those messages to member states and come up with exactly the right formula by which they are grateful and happy and supportive with regards to membership, and membership counts, while also making sure that those ties aren't so tight that they ultimately wind up producing an enormous backlash in one of the member states, something akin to Brexit. So it is the most difficult of balancing acts, and it's a question the EU hasn't really had to ask itself up until now.
That's a very good question, Amelia. Peter, your reaction? Juncker only ever had one word in his lexicon, and that was integration. Does that still fly in 2021?
I think on the long term, indeed, this will change. Brexit will serve as the great precedent whenever countries don't get along fundamentally with something the EU wants to do. They will tend to point at the option to leave. Now, I'm not one of these people who think that there's any chance of any other member state leaving anytime soon. But it will serve as some kind of a threat. And I think a break on attempts to centralize power and money at the EU level. I think if you look at the EU, one of its great successes has been the single market, has been to scrap barriers to trade. And I think whenever there is tension in the EU, it has little to do with the single market. It's always about transfers. So I think the EU has to reflect and concludes that the British left not because they were unhappy about the single market and the opening of trade barriers, but because they were unhappy about the overreach of power, the centralization of power.
And last word, Professor Hadfield, where will we be in 1 year's time? Forgetting COVID, but in terms of relations between London and Brussels.
I'm going to play the optimistic Canadian card here, Stephen, if that's all right.
Is that because we've done a Canadian deal?
It's the beginning of a beautiful relationship. I think it's got some bruises on it, but I do feel that absent major blow-ups that require an arbitration panel, the work can progress nicely in parallel, and there is genuine scope for alignment in areas. But I think Peter's put his finger on a very key point. The appetite at this point for pro-deepening and pro-integration dynamics just isn't there. And the Brexit precedent will be firmly looked at, very carefully looked at by a variety of other member states. So the EU does need to think carefully about who it wants to be.
Okay, well, that is a very positive way to finish this. At the beginning of a beautiful relationship. That's all we have time for, but Peter Klepper and Professor Amelia Hadfield, thank you both so much for joining us here on this special agenda. The negotiations were always going to go down to the wire, and so it proved. The big issue all along was the so-called level playing field for trade, including fishing. The EU was unwilling, as they saw it, to let Britain have its cake and eat it by having large access to the EU's market while not paying the price it wanted for Brexit. Otherwise, the EU thought other restless member states might get ideas that leaving the club was a smart option. One European survey had found that 45% of Italians and 38% in France would be more likely to support leaving the EU if the UK was in a good state in 5 years' time. Non-Eurozone states like Hungary and Poland could pull out even more easily than France and Italy. From the very beginning, though, the whole question of British and European integration has turned fundamentally on the question of sovereignty. So 4 years and 6 months to the day after the European referendum, a fair and realistic deal with the EU that respects UK sovereignty was the best kind of Christmas present for a troubled nation. The challenge now is for present and future British governments to show that sovereignty is not an empty word. Despite the at times ugly rhetoric which had dominated the headlines, let's hope both sides really want to reach agreement by setting the stage for a future without hostility and distrust. As UK Cabinet Minister Michael Gove said, the spirit of common endeavour should be what animates us for the year to come. Coming up on a future agenda, we'll be looking ahead to 2021 and asking what the future might hold in a post-pandemic world. Don't forget, for more agenda content, you can visit our website or you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.